The cabin creaked like old bones in the wind, its weathered walls straining against the relentless assault of snow that had been falling for 3 days straight. Thessaly pressed her face against the frost-etched window, watching the world disappear beneath a blanket of white. The glass felt like ice against her cheek, numbing the skin that had grown pale from sleepless nights. Inside, the fire had died to embers hours ago, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. The silence was absolute except for the wind's howling and the occasional groan of timber under pressure. She should have left before the storm began, should have listened to the weather warnings, but something had kept her here in this isolated place where cell towers couldn't reach and the nearest neighbor was miles away through impassable drifts. Thessaly wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the familiar ache of loneliness that had driven her to this remote sanctuary. At 42, she had thought she'd made peace with solitude, but the voices of her family still echoed in her mind, their words sharp as winter wind. The anniversary dinner had been 3 weeks ago, the dinner where everything changed, where she'd finally spoken the words that had been building inside her like pressure in a sealed vessel. Now, in this place where reality seemed as fragile as the icicles hanging from the eaves, she wondered if she had imagined it all. The cabin felt alive around her, responding to her thoughts with creaks and sighs, as if it too was lonely, as if it too carried secrets that grew heavier with each passing hour. She turned from the window as another sound reached her ears, footsteps crunching through snow, too rhythmic to be the wind. Someone was coming through the storm, someone who shouldn't exist in this place where no one could survive the cold. Thessaly's breath caught in her throat as a shadow moved past the window, and she realized she was no longer alone. The months before the storm had been a slow descent into a peculiar kind of madness. Thessaly Corvina had built her life like a careful architecture, each piece fitted precisely to create the illusion of completeness. Her Victorian house on Maple Street stood like a monument to her independence, restored hardwood floors, vintage wallpaper she'd hung herself, a garden that bloomed in careful succession from spring through fall. At 42, she had crafted what she thought was contentment from the raw materials of solitude. But contentment, she had learned, was not the same as peace. The family gatherings had become exercises in endurance. Each holiday, each birthday, each anniversary brought the same litany of concerned questions disguised as casual conversation. Her sister Cordelia would arrive with her husband and their 3 children, filling the space with the comfortable chaos of a complete family. Her mother, Ophelia, would hover at the edges of conversations, her eyes carrying the weight of unspoken disappointments. "You know," Thessaly, Cordelia had said at Easter, her voice carefully modulated to sound caring rather than critical, "there's still time. 42 isn't too late if you really want children. Look at Janet Morrison, she had her first at 45. Thessaly had smiled the smile she perfected over the years, the one that neither confirmed nor denied, that left room for hope while revealing nothing of her inner landscape. "I'm quite happy as I am," she'd replied, words that felt like cotton in her mouth. But were they true? In the weeks that followed, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her own desires. The house felt larger somehow, its rooms echoing with an emptiness that hadn't bothered her before. She would catch herself pausing in doorways, listening for sounds that never came, the patter of small feet, the murmur of conversation, the lived-in noise of a family home. The dreams had started then, vivid and unsettling. She would find herself in rooms she'd never seen, holding conversations with people whose faces dissolved when she tried to focus on them. In these dreams, her house was full of laughter and warmth, but when she woke, the silence felt like a physical presence, heavy and expectant. Her work as a manuscript editor had always been solitary, but now the isolation felt oppressive. She would spend hours with the words of others, shaping their stories into something coherent and beautiful, while her own narrative remained unclear. The authors she worked with wrote about love and loss, about families torn apart and rebuilt, about the deep human need for connection. Their words began to seep into her consciousness, blurring the lines between their fictional lives and her reality. Summer passed in a haze of social obligations and increasingly frequent family interventions. Her mother would call with updates about the neighbors' children, about wedding announcements and baby showers, each conversation a gentle but persistent reminder of what Thessaly lacked. Cordelia would stop by unannounced, her children tumbling through the house like a promise of what could be. "Don't you ever feel lonely?" Cordelia asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching her children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "I mean, truly lonely?" The question hung in the air like the humid summer night, heavy with implications. Thessaly had considered it seriously, turning it over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by worry. Did she feel lonely? Or had she simply convinced herself that solitude was a choice rather than a circumstance? Sometimes, she admitted, the honesty surprising her. But loneliness in a crowd can be worse than loneliness alone. Cordelia had nodded as if she understood, but Thessaly could see the confusion in her sister's eyes. How could someone who had never been alone truly comprehend the peculiar freedom of an unshared life? As autumn approached, the family pressure intensified. The annual anniversary dinner was coming, a tradition that celebrated their parents' 50-year marriage with a gathering of children, grandchildren, and the extended constellation of their shared life. It was always held at Cordelia's house, a sprawling colonial that could accommodate the crowd, and it was always the same, a celebration of conventional happiness that made Thessaly feel like an observer of her own life. This year, however, something was different. The dreams had become more frequent, more vivid. She would wake with the taste of birthday cake in her mouth, the sound of children's laughter still echoing in her ears. Her house began to feel strange, as if it were waiting for something, as if it too were holding its breath in anticipation of change. The manuscript she was editing that fall was a psychological thriller about a woman who believed she was living someone else's life. The protagonist would find evidence of experiences she couldn't remember, photographs of places she'd never been, letters written in her handwriting about events that had never happened. As Thessaly worked on the book, she began to notice odd details in her own life, a coffee cup in the sink that she didn't remember using, flowers in her garden that she hadn't planted, a faint scent of baby powder in her spare bedroom. She told herself it was stress, that the family pressure was making her imagination run wild. But the evidence kept accumulating like snow before a storm. A woman at the grocery store smiled and waved as if they were old friends, though Thessaly was certain they'd never met. Her neighbor Mrs. Henderson asked about the little one, then looked confused when Thessaly claimed not to know what she meant. The breaking point came 2 weeks before the anniversary dinner. Thessaly was working late in her home office when she heard the sound of crying from upstairs. Not the wind, not the old house settling, unmistakably the sound of a child in distress. She climbed the stairs slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, following the sound to the spare bedroom she'd always kept as a guest room. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, she could see movement, a shadow against the wall that looked like someone rocking a crying baby. But when she pushed the door open, the room was empty, furnished only with the antique bed and dresser that had been there for years. The crying had stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence that had become her constant companion. That night, she made a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. She would attend the anniversary dinner, but this time, she would not smile and deflect and promise that everything was fine. This time, she would tell them the truth, or at least, a version of the truth that felt more real than the careful lies she'd been living. The anniversary dinner was held on the first Saturday of November, when the leaves had turned brilliant shades of copper and gold, and the air carried the promise of winter. Cordelia's house glowed with warm light, every window a rectangle of golden welcome against the gathering dusk. Cars lined the circular driveway, their father's ancient Buick, their uncle's pickup truck, the minivans and SUVs that transported the next generation. Thessaly sat in her car for a long moment before going in, watching the silhouettes move past the windows. She could see Cordelia directing traffic in the kitchen, her husband James corralling their 3 children, their parents settled in the living room with their collection of grandchildren arranged around them like offerings. It was a scene of domestic perfection, the kind of tableau that magazines used to illustrate the meaning of family. But as she watched, the scene began to feel wrong somehow, like a photograph that had been overexposed. The figures moved too deliberately, their interactions too choreographed. The warm light took on an artificial quality, and she found herself wondering if this was how her life looked to others, a performance rather than a reality. When she finally entered the house, the noise hit her like a physical force. Children's laughter mixed with adult conversation, the clatter of dishes, the underlying hum of multiple conversations happening simultaneously. Her mother, Ophelia, appeared at her elbow almost immediately, her smile bright but worried. "There you are, darling. I was beginning to think you weren't coming." Ophelia's hand rested briefly on Thessaly's arm, a gesture that managed to be both affectionate and anxious. "You look tired. Are you sleeping well?" "I'm fine, Mother." The words came automatically, part of the script they'd been performing for years. But even as she said them, Thessaly could feel something shifting inside her, like ice beginning to crack under pressure. The evening progressed with its familiar rhythm. Dinner was served on the good china, the conversation flowing around the table like a well-rehearsed play. Uncle Marcus told his stories about the old days. Cordelia's children performed their latest accomplishments, and their parents presided over it all with the satisfaction of people who had built something lasting. But underneath the comfortable surface, Thessaly could feel the current of expectation. Glances were exchanged when they thought she wasn't looking. Conversations paused when she approached, then resumed with just a little too much enthusiasm. She was the family's puzzle, the piece that didn't quite fit the picture they were trying to create. "Thessaly's been working on the most fascinating manuscript," Cordelia announced during dessert, her voice carrying the forced cheer of someone trying to steer a conversation. "Tell them about it, Thess." All eyes turned to her, expectant and slightly concerned. Thessaly set down her fork carefully, feeling the weight of their attention like a physical presence. The manuscript, the psychological thriller about the woman living someone else's life, felt suddenly relevant in a way that made her skin crawl. "It's about a woman who discovers she's been living a lie," she said slowly, watching their faces for reactions. "She finds evidence of a life she doesn't remember having. Photographs, letters, people who know her but whom she's never met. Sounds disturbing." Their father, Erasmus, commented with a slight frown. "Why would someone want to read about something like that?" "Because," Thessaly said, her voice gaining strength, "sometimes the lies we tell ourselves are more comfortable than the truth." A silence fell over the table, broken only by the distant sound of children playing in the next room. Ophelia's fork clinked against her plate as she set it down, and Thessaly could see the wheels turning behind her mother's eyes. "Speaking of truth," Cordelia said with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes, "we've been wondering when you're going to bring someone home for one of these dinners. You're not getting any younger, and—" "Actually," Thessaly interrupted, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "there's something I need to tell you all." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable pauses that had punctuated the evening. This silence had weight, expectation, the held breath of people preparing for news they might not want to hear. Thessaly could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, but her mind felt strangely clear, as if she were watching the scene from outside herself. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like smoke, visible and impossible to take back. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then the table erupted in confusion. "Pregnant?" Ophelia's voice was barely a whisper. "But you're not seeing anyone," Cordelia said, her confusion evident. "You haven't mentioned." "When?" Erasmus demanded, his practical mind grappling with logistics. "How far along? Who's the father?" Thessaly looked around the table at their shocked faces, feeling a strange sense of detachment. She had spoken the words, but now they felt foreign, as if someone else had said them using her voice. 6 months, she heard herself say. "The father isn't in the picture." 6 months. Cordelia's voice pitched higher. "But you don't look. I mean, how could we not have noticed?" Thessaly's hands moved instinctively to her stomach, which felt flat and unchanged beneath her sweater. But in her mind, she could feel the weight, the presence, the undeniable reality of the life growing inside her. "Some women don't show," she said, the words coming from somewhere deep in her subconscious. "I've been seeing a doctor. Everything's fine." The chaos that followed blurred together. Questions she couldn't answer, congratulations that felt hollow, plans being made for a future that felt as insubstantial as morning mist. Through it all, Thessaly sat in strange calm, watching her family's reactions as if she were studying characters for a story she was editing. It wasn't until she was driving home through the November darkness that the full weight of what she'd done settled over her. She had lied to her family, created a fiction so elaborate that she wasn't sure where it ended and reality began. But as she pulled into her driveway and saw her house waiting in the darkness, empty and expectant, the lie felt more real than the truth she'd been living. That night, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, lifting her sweater and examining her reflection. Her stomach looked exactly as it always had, but when she placed her hands on it, she could swear she felt movement, a flutter of life that might have been her imagination or might have been something more. The dreams that came were different now, more vivid and immediate. She was in a hospital room, holding a baby whose face she couldn't quite see. Nurses moved around her like benevolent spirits, and through the window, she could see snow falling in thick, heavy flakes. When she woke, The taste of antiseptic was strong in her mouth, and she could hear the wind beginning to howl outside her windows. The storm was coming, just as the weather reports had predicted, and she knew with absolute certainty that she needed to get away, to find a place where she could sort through the tangle of truth and fiction that her life had become. The cabin had been a gift from a grateful author whose manuscript she'd saved from editorial disaster. It's completely isolated, he'd told her. Perfect for when you need to think. Now, as the first flakes began to fall outside her window, Thessaly knew that thinking was exactly what she needed to do. She packed quickly, throwing clothes and supplies into her car with the efficiency of someone fleeing a disaster. The cabin was 2 hours north, up winding mountain roads that would be treacherous in snow, but she felt compelled to go, drawn by the promise of silence and solitude. As she drove through the gathering storm, her hands moved again to her stomach, feeling for the life that her mind insisted was there. The radio crackled with weather warnings, but she drove on, following the narrow beam of her headlights into the darkness that seemed to match the confusion in her mind. The cabin materialized from the snow like something conjured from a dream. Thessaly's headlights swept across weathered cedar siding and windows that reflected the storm back at her in fragments. She'd made the drive on instinct more than memory, following roads that seemed to dissolve behind her as she passed, leaving her suspended in a world of white and wind. Inside, the cabin felt both familiar and strange, as if she'd been there before in another life. The furnishings were simple, a stone fireplace, rustic furniture that had been chosen for durability rather than beauty, walls lined with books left behind by previous occupants. She'd stayed here once before, during a particularly difficult editing project, but now it felt different, charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. She built a fire with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the adrenaline that had carried her through the evening's revelations. The flames caught quickly, filling the room with dancing light that made the shadows seem alive. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending drafts through gaps in the old construction. The silence between the wind gusts was profound, the kind of quiet that city dwellers never experienced. But as Thessaly sat beside the fire, she began to hear other sounds, the settling of old wood, the whisper of snow against glass, and underneath it all, something that might have been breathing that wasn't her own. She told herself it was imagination, stress manifesting as auditory hallucinations. The evening at Cordelia's house felt like something that had happened to someone else, a story she'd read rather than lived. Had she really announced a pregnancy that existed only in her mind? Had she really looked into the faces of her family and spoken words that had no basis in reality? But even as doubt gnawed at her, her hands kept returning to her stomach, and each time she was surprised by the flatness, the absence of the bulge that felt so real in her mind. She found herself sitting differently, moving more carefully, as if protecting something precious and fragile. The first night passed in fitful sleep punctuated by dreams that felt more like memories. She was in the hospital room again, but this time she could see the baby's face clearly. Features that were unmistakably hers mixed with someone else's, someone whose identity remained frustratingly out of reach. The baby cried, and she reached for it, but her arms passed through empty air. She woke to gray morning light filtering through snow-heavy windows. The storm had continued through the night, piling drifts against the doors and burying her car completely. She was truly isolated now, cut off from the world she'd fled and forced to confront the labyrinth of her own mind. The cabin felt smaller in daylight, more cramped. She found herself pacing from room to room, touching objects that seemed to pulse with significance she couldn't quite grasp. In the bedroom, she discovered clothes that weren't hers, maternity clothes in her size, hanging in the closet as if waiting for her to need them. Her rational mind insisted they must have been left by a previous occupant, but when she held them up to herself, they fit perfectly, designed for a body that was changing in ways hers never had. She found herself putting them on, and for the first time in weeks, her reflection looked right, looked like the person she was becoming rather than the person she'd been. The books on the shelves seemed to have rearranged themselves overnight, titles about pregnancy and childbirth prominently displayed where she was sure she'd seen mysteries and thrillers the night before. She pulled one down, a guide to natural childbirth, and found margin notes in handwriting that looked like hers but contained information she didn't remember learning. Contractions begin slowly, one note read, like waves building toward shore. Another, remember to breathe through the pain. It's your body doing what it was made to do. The rational explanation was that she was having some kind of breakdown, that the pressure from her family and her own unacknowledged longing for connection had fractured her grip on reality. But the alternative explanation, that she was somehow living multiple lives simultaneously, that the pregnancy existed in some parallel version of herself, felt no less plausible in the strange atmosphere of the storm-bound cabin. On the second day, the sounds began. At first, she thought it was the wind, or perhaps the cabin settling under the weight of snow. But as she sat reading by the fire, she began to distinguish patterns in the noise, footsteps overhead, the creak of floorboards under weight that wasn't hers. When she climbed to the loft, she found it empty, but the dust on the floor showed disturbances that looked like footprints. That afternoon, she heard crying, not the wind this time, but unmistakably the sound of an infant in distress. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the cabin with desperate wails that made her breast ache with sympathy. She searched every room, every closet, but found nothing except the growing certainty that she was not alone. The third night brought the first clear sound of another presence, not crying this time, but humming. A gentle lullaby that seemed to drift through the walls themselves, wordless and hauntingly familiar. Thessaly followed the sound through the cabin, but it always seemed to be coming from the room she'd just left, leading her in circles through her own confusion. She found herself humming along, the melody emerging from some deep well of memory she didn't know she possessed. Her hands moved in rhythm with the song, rocking motions that felt natural and necessary, as if she were holding something infinitely precious. When she caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror, she gasped. Her reflection showed a woman she barely recognized, skin glowing with health, eyes bright with an inner light, and unmistakably, a rounded belly that pressed against the maternity shirt she didn't remember putting on. She lifted the shirt with shaking hands, staring at the impossible curve of her body. The skin was taut and marked with the faint lines that spoke of growth, of life expanding within her. When she pressed her palms against it, she felt movement, not the flutter of imagination, but the definite kick of a child ready to be born. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn, but the bathroom was empty. In the mirror, however, she could see a second reflection, a woman who looked exactly like her but different somehow, softer and more settled, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. "You're finally seeing me," the reflection said, though Thessaly's own mouth hadn't moved. The reflection in the mirror didn't move when Thessaly moved. It stood perfectly still, hands resting on a belly that was unmistakably full with child, eyes that held knowledge Thessaly didn't possess. The bathroom felt charged with an electric tension, as if reality itself were straining under the weight of impossibility. "You can't be real," Thessaly whispered, but her reflection, the other version of herself, smiled with gentle understanding. "I'm as real as you are," the reflection replied. "Maybe more real. I'm the version of you that made different choices, that said yes instead of no, that embraced possibility instead of hiding from it." Thessaly reached out to touch the mirror, and her reflection did the same. But when their fingertips met the glass, Thessaly felt warmth, flesh against flesh, as if the barrier between worlds had dissolved. "This isn't possible," she said, even as part of her mind catalogued the evidence, the maternity clothes, the pregnancy books, the crying she'd heard, the way her body felt different even though it looked the same. "You've been living half a life," the reflection continued, editing other people's stories while your own remained unwritten, watching from the sidelines while your family built something beautiful. But I chose differently. I took the risk." "What risk?" Thessaly's voice was barely audible above the wind that continued to rage outside. "The risk of loving someone completely. The risk of creating life. The risk of being vulnerable and open and potentially heartbroken." The reflection's hand moved in slow circles over her belly. "You remember him, don't you? Even if you convinced yourself to forget." Images flashed through Thessaly's mind, fragments of memory she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten they existed. A man's laugh in a coffee shop, conversations that lasted until dawn, hands that touched her with reverence and passion. His name rose from the depths of her consciousness like a bubble surfacing in dark water. Caspian. He was the manuscript, she whispered, understanding flooding through her. The psychological thriller about the woman living someone else's life. He was the author. "You fell in love with him," the reflection said. "But you were so afraid of being hurt, so convinced that love was a trap that would steal your independence, that you ended it before it could begin. You chose safety over possibility." The memories came flooding back now, no longer fragments but complete scenes. Caspian with his dark hair and thoughtful eyes, the way he looked at her as if she were the most fascinating person he'd ever met. The night he told her he loved her, and how she'd panicked and ended their relationship the next day, claiming she needed to focus on her career. But I made a different choice, the reflection continued. I stayed. I let myself love him and be loved in return. And when he asked me to marry him, I said yes. When we decided to have a child, I didn't let fear talk me out of it. Then why are you here? Thessaly asked. Why are you in my reflection? Because you're finally ready to choose, the reflection said. You've been living between worlds, half in the life you have and half in the life you could have had. The announcement at dinner was your subconscious mind trying to bridge the gap, trying to make the life you want real through sheer force of will. The cabin seemed to pulse around them, walls breathing with a rhythm that matched Thessaly's heartbeat. Through the windows, the storm continued its assault, but the sound had changed, becoming less like wind and more like voices, whispers of encouragement, of possibility, of futures that hung in the balance. You can't just decide to be pregnant, Thessaly said, but even as she spoke the words, she felt their inadequacy. She'd been editing reality for months, changing the story of her life through small acts of will and desire. Can't you? The reflection asked. You're an editor. You know that stories are fluid things, that the right changes in the right places can transform everything. What if you could edit your own life? What if you could choose which story to make real? Thessaly looked down at her own body, still flat and unchanged in the harsh bathroom light. But when she looked back at the mirror, she saw herself as she could be, glowing with health and purpose, carrying life within her, no longer afraid of the future. It's not that simple, she said, but the protest felt weak. Isn't it? The reflection's voice was getting fainter, as if she were speaking from a great distance. You announced the pregnancy because part of you already knew it was true. Not true in the way the world measures truth, but true in the way that matters. True in the story you're choosing to tell. The mirror began to ripple like water, the reflection wavering and becoming indistinct. But before it faded completely, Thessaly heard her other self speak one final time. He's coming, you know. He never stopped loving you. The storm brought him here, just like it brought you. Choose wisely, Thessaly. Some chances don't come twice. The reflection dissolved, leaving only Thessaly's familiar face staring back at her from the glass. But the memory of that other self, that other life, remained vivid and compelling. She pressed her hands to her stomach again, and this time, she allowed herself to believe in the life she felt growing there. The sound of footsteps on the porch made her freeze. Heavy boots crunching through snow, the scrape of someone clearing ice from the door. A knock echoed through the cabin, not the random tapping of wind-blown debris, but the deliberate rhythm of human presence. Thessaly walked to the front door on unsteady legs, her hand hovering over the lock. Through the frosted glass, she could see a dark figure silhouetted against the white landscape, but she couldn't make out features or details. Thessaly. The voice was muffled by wind and glass, but unmistakable. Thessaly, I know you're in there. Please, let me in. Caspian. Somehow, impossibly, he had found her in the storm, had tracked her to this isolated cabin where she'd come to sort through the wreckage of her reality. Her hand trembled as she reached for the lock, knowing that whatever happened next would determine not just her immediate future, but the very nature of the truth she would choose to live. The lock clicked open, and she pulled the door wide, letting the storm and the man and the possibility of a different life flood into her carefully constructed sanctuary. Caspian stood in the doorway like a figure carved from winter itself, his dark coat dusted with snow, his face red from cold and wind. But his eyes, those thoughtful brown eyes she remembered so well, were exactly as they had been in her buried memories, warm and intense and filled with an emotion she convinced herself she'd imagined. Jesus, Thessaly, he said, stamping snow from his boots as he stepped inside. I've been driving through this storm for hours trying to find you. Your sister told me you might be here. She closed the door behind him, her mind reeling. Cordelia told you where I was? She's worried about you. He shrugged out of his coat, revealing the lean frame she remembered, the hands that had once traced the curve of her face with such tenderness. They're all worried. The way you left after dinner, the things you said. What things? The question escaped before she could stop it, genuine confusion coloring her voice. Caspian studied her face, and she could see him cataloging the changes, the pallor, the shadows under her eyes, the way she held herself as if protecting something fragile. The pregnancy, Thessaly. You announced you were pregnant, and then you disappeared into a blizzard. Of course they're worried. The pregnancy. She'd almost forgotten that she'd made it real in that world, spoken it aloud to her family, given it weight and substance through the power of declaration. But looking at Caspian now, she felt the truth of it resonate through her body, not just the pregnancy itself, but the story that surrounded it, the choices that had led to this moment. "Sit down," she said, gesturing toward the fire. "You must be frozen." He moved to the hearth gratefully, holding his hands out to the flames. The warm light played across his features, emphasizing the lines that hadn't been there 3 years ago, the slight graying at his temples that spoke of time passing and opportunities missed. "I never expected to see you again," he said quietly, not looking at her. "When you ended things between us, you made it pretty clear that you wanted me out of your life completely." "I know." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. "I was afraid." "Of what?" He turned to face her then, and she could see the old hurt in his eyes, the wound that had never properly healed. "Of being happy? Of letting someone care about you? Of losing myself," she said, and realized it was the truth she'd never been able to speak before. "I'd built this life, this identity as someone who didn't need anyone else. I was terrified that if I let you in, I'd disappear entirely." Caspian's laugh was bitter. "And instead you disappeared anyway. Cut yourself off from everyone who mattered, buried yourself in work, convinced yourself that being alone was the same as being free." The accusation stung because it was accurate. She had disappeared, had chosen isolation over the risk of intimacy, had edited herself out of her own story rather than face the possibility of revision. "Why are you here?" she asked. "I mean, really. It's not just because Cordelia was worried." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it over the wind. "Because I never stopped loving you," he said. "Because I've spent the last 3 years trying to convince myself that what we had wasn't real, that I imagined the connection between us. But when your sister called me, told me what you'd announced at dinner." He looked at her directly, and she could see her own confusion reflected in his eyes. "Is it mine?" The question hung between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or burn. In the logical world, the world of facts and medical evidence, there was no pregnancy to claim or disclaim. But in the story she was constructing, the life she was choosing to inhabit, the answer was both complex and simple. "Yes," she said, and felt the word reshape reality around them. He closed his eyes, and she watched his face cycle through emotions, shock, joy, fear, something that might have been relief. When he opened them again, she could see that he had made his own choice about which version of truth to embrace. "How long have you known?" he asked. 6 months, she replied, the same answer she'd given her family, and with each repetition it became more real, more solid. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't even know if you'd want to know." "Of course I'd want to know." He moved closer to her, his hands reaching out as if to touch her face, then stopping just short of contact. "God, Thessaly, a baby. Our baby." The possessive pronoun sent a thrill through her that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Our baby. The child that existed in the space between what was and what could be, the life they'd created through want and will and the strange alchemy of desperate hope. "I've been so scared," she whispered, and realized it was the most honest thing she'd said in years. "I don't know how to be a mother. I don't know how to share my life with someone else." "You don't have to figure it out all at once," he said gently. "We can learn together." "We." The word that had terrified her for so long now felt like a promise, a foundation upon which something beautiful could be built. She let herself imagine it, waking up beside him, feeling their child move within her, building a life that was messy and complicated and real. "Can I?" he asked, gesturing toward her stomach. She nodded, and his hand settled gently over the place where their child was growing. His touch was warm through the fabric of her shirt, and she could swear she felt movement in response, their baby recognizing its father's presence. "I can feel it," he whispered, wonder coloring his voice. "It's really there." For that moment, suspended between storm and firelight, between past and future, Thessaly allowed herself to believe completely. The pregnancy was real because they made it real, because they chose to inhabit a story where love conquered fear and possibility trumped caution. But even as she surrendered to the fantasy, a part of her mind remained coldly analytical, cataloging the impossibilities. She wasn't pregnant, couldn't be pregnant, because she and Caspian hadn't been together in 3 years. The maternity clothes, the movement she felt, the reflection in the mirror, all of it was elaborate self-deception, her psyche's desperate attempt to transform longing into reality. The thought must have shown on her face, because Caspian's expression shifted from wonder to concern. "What is it?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," she said quietly. "Maybe we both have." The wind outside seemed to respond to her words, howling with renewed fury and rattling the windows until she thought they might shatter. The fire flickered as if disturbed by some invisible presence, and the shadows in the room began to move independently of the flames. "Thessaly," Caspian said, his voice taking on a note of worry. "When was the last time you slept? I mean, really slept." She tried to remember, but the days since her announcement blurred together in her mind. Had it been 3 days since the dinner? 4? Time felt elastic in the cabin, stretching and contracting according to some rhythm she couldn't identify. "I've been having dreams," she said instead of answering. "Dreams where everything is different. Where we never broke up, where we got married. Where?" She gestured helplessly at her stomach. "Where we had a child together," he finished softly. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but troubled. "Thessaly, I need to tell you something. Something you might not want to hear." The tone of his voice sent ice through her veins. "What?" "I wasn't just in the area when your sister called. I've been living here, in town, for the past 6 months. I moved back after." He paused, searching for words. "After the accident." "What accident?" But even as she asked, she could feel knowledge hovering at the edge of her consciousness, dark and unwelcome. "The car accident," he said carefully. "Last spring. You were driving to see me. I'd called, asked you to meet me, said I had something important to tell you. But it was raining, and the roads were slick, and—" "No," she whispered, but the memories were surfacing now, unstoppable as floodwater. The phone call on a rainy April night, Caspian's voice urgent and hopeful. The drive through the storm, her hands gripping the wheel as she tried to navigate roads made treacherous by rain. The moment when everything went wrong, the skid, the impact, the darkness that followed. "You were hurt badly," Caspian continued, his voice breaking. "Head trauma. You were in a coma for 2 weeks, and when you woke up—" He took a shaky breath. "When you woke up, you didn't remember the accident. Didn't remember me calling. Didn't remember why you were driving that night. The doctors said it might come back eventually, or it might not." The cabin seemed to tilt around her, reality shifting like a kaleidoscope turned by an invisible hand. The warmth she'd felt in her belly, the movement she was sure she'd experienced, all of it suddenly felt hollow, the phantom sensations of a mind trying to repair itself with fiction. "But I feel it," she said desperately, pressing her hands to her stomach. "I can feel the baby moving." Caspian's eyes filled with tears. "There was a baby, Thessaly. That's what I called to tell you that night. You were pregnant. We'd conceived during that one night we spent together last year, when you called me and said you'd made a mistake, that you wanted to try again." The night came back to her in fragments, her loneliness finally overwhelming her pride. The phone call she'd made in the darkness of her empty house, the way he'd held her afterward as if she might disappear. They'd talked about trying again, about taking things slowly, but then her old fears had reasserted themselves and she'd pulled away once more. "The pregnancy test was positive," she whispered, the memory surfacing like a bubble of air from deep water. "I was going to tell you that night, when I drove through the storm." "Yes," he said softly. "But the accident, you lost the baby, Thessaly. The trauma was too severe. By the time you woke up, it was gone, and you didn't remember it had ever existed." The words hit her like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the reality she'd constructed. The pregnancy wasn't a fantasy. It was a memory, a life that had been real for a brief, shining moment before being taken away by rain and metal and the cruel mathematics of impact. "No," she said again, but with less conviction. The movement in her belly had stopped, the warmth had fled, leaving only the familiar emptiness she'd carried for so long. "The doctors said your mind might try to reconstruct what was lost," Caspian said gently. "That trauma sometimes makes us create elaborate fictions to replace unbearable truths." She looked down at herself and saw that she was wearing her own clothes again, jeans and a sweater, no sign of the maternity shirts that had fit so perfectly. Her reflection in the dark window showed her familiar form, unchanged and unencumbered by the life she'd convinced herself she carried. "But it felt so real," she whispered. "Because it was real, for a while. And because you needed it to be real again." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. "The announcement at dinner, the way you've been acting. Your family is worried because they can see you slipping away from the life you have and into the life you lost." The storm outside was beginning to subside, the wind's howl softening to a whisper. Through the windows, She could see the first faint signs of dawn, gray light filtering through clouds heavy with spent snow. The cabin felt different now, smaller and more mundane, stripped of the strange charge that had made everything seem possible. "What happens now?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Now we grieve," Caspian said simply. "For what we lost, for what might have been. And then, if you're willing, we try to figure out what we can still build together." She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the phantom lover of her memories but the real man who had loved her through her fears and failures, who had found her in a storm and stayed to help her piece together the fragments of her shattered world. "I don't know how," she admitted. "Neither do I," he said. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can learn together." Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the first pale rays of sunlight were beginning to penetrate the clouds. The storm was over, but Thessaly knew that the real work, the hard business of living with truth instead of comforting fiction, was just beginning. The dawn light revealed a world transformed by the storm. Snow lay in pristine drifts against the cabin walls, unmarked except for the single track of footprints that led from where Caspian had abandoned his car to the front door. The silence that followed the wind's retreat felt pregnant with possibility and loss in equal measure. Thessaly sat by the dying fire, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of wood smoke and winter air. Caspian had made coffee on the small propane stove, and she held the cup like a talisman, letting its warmth ground her in the present moment. The phantom sensations of pregnancy had faded completely now, leaving behind an emptiness that felt both familiar and devastating. "Tell me about the night I called you," she said quietly. "The night when the baby was conceived." Caspian settled beside her on the couch, careful not to sit too close, respecting the fragile space between them. "It was in October. You'd been editing that manuscript, the psychological thriller about the woman living multiple lives. You called me at midnight, crying." The memory surfaced slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. She'd been working late, immersed in the protagonist's confusion about reality and identity, when the parallels to her own life had become too overwhelming to bear. "I told you I'd made a mistake," she said, the words coming back to her. "That I'd been wrong to end things between us. You said you were tired of being afraid, tired of editing your life into something safe and small." His voice was soft, remembering. "You asked if I still loved you, and you said yes. I never stopped saying yes, Thessaly, even when you wouldn't listen." That night came back to her in vivid detail now, how he'd driven over immediately, how they'd talked until dawn about dreams and fears and the courage it took to build something real with another person. How making love had felt like coming home after a long exile, like editing her life story to include the chapters she'd been too frightened to write. "When I woke up beside you that morning," she said, "I panicked. You said it was a mistake, that you'd gotten caught up in the emotion of the moment, that nothing had really changed." The old hurt was back in his voice, but tempered now by understanding. "You left before I could even make you coffee. But I was already pregnant." Yes, though neither of us knew it then. She tried to imagine how different everything would have been if she'd been brave enough to stay that morning, if she'd allowed herself to believe in the possibility of lasting happiness. The baby would have been born by now, a tangible reminder of love's ability to create something entirely new from the raw materials of hope and desire. "What were you going to tell me that night?" she asked. "When you called and asked me to drive over?" Caspian was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he'd been asking himself for months. "I was going to ask you to marry me," he said finally. "I'd bought a ring. Had this whole speech planned about how love wasn't about losing yourself, but about becoming more yourself than you'd ever been alone. I was going to tell you that I knew you were scared, but that I was willing to take it slow, to build something together one day at a time." The words hit her like physical blows, each one a reminder of the future that had been stolen by rain and metal and her own terrible timing. She could see it all so clearly, the proposal, the wedding, the pregnancy announcement to her family under very different circumstances. A life built on courage instead of fear, on inclusion instead of isolation. "The storm that night was so bad," she continued, following the thread of memory. "I almost turned back twice. But you didn't." "No. I was so afraid I'd lose my nerve if I waited until morning. I kept thinking about the manuscript I was editing, about the woman who discovered she'd been living the wrong life. I didn't want to be her anymore. The irony was bitter. In trying to escape a fictional life of missed opportunities, she'd driven into a storm that would cost her the very real opportunity she'd been racing toward. The accident had stolen not just their child, but the chance to build the life they'd both wanted. Do you remember the impact? Caspian asked gently. She closed her eyes, letting the memory surface despite the pain it brought. The car started to skid on a curve. I tried to correct it, but the road was so slick. I remember the guardrail rushing toward me, and then she opened her eyes, looking at him with wonder and horror. Then nothing until I woke up in the hospital. You were lucky to survive, he said. The doctors weren't sure you would at first. And when you did wake up, you didn't remember anything from that day. Not the phone call, not the drive, not why you were on that road in the first place. Did I remember you at all? You knew who I was, but you thought we were still broken up. You couldn't understand why I was there, why I was so upset. The head trauma had erased the most recent memories, the night we spent together, the decision to give us another chance, all of it. She could imagine how that must have felt for him, to have the woman he loved look at him with polite confusion, to have their tentative reconciliation wiped away as if it had never happened. No wonder he'd looked so haunted when he'd first walked through the door. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. After I recovered. Why didn't you explain what we'd been trying to build? I tried, he said sadly. But you thought I was making it up, trying to manipulate you into a relationship you didn't want. You said I was taking advantage of your confusion, trying to rewrite history to suit my own desires. The doctors advised me to give you space, to let your memories return naturally rather than forcing them. But they never did return. Not until now. And even now, I'm not sure if you're remembering or if your mind is constructing new fictions to fill the gaps. The question hung between them like a blade. How could she know what was real memory and what was elaborate self-deception? How could anyone navigate the borderland between truth and the stories we tell ourselves to survive unbearable loss? The family dinner, she said suddenly. When I announced the pregnancy, that wasn't memory, was it? That was my mind trying to make the lost pregnancy real again. I think so, yes. Your sister said you seemed different that night, disconnected from reality in a way that scared her. When you left immediately afterward and disappeared into the storm, she knew something was seriously wrong. Thessaly set down her coffee cup and buried her face in her hands. The weight of her own delusion was crushing. The elaborate fantasy she'd constructed, the way she'd convinced herself she could edit reality through sheer force of will. Her family must think she was having a complete breakdown. They probably want to have me committed, she said through her fingers. They want to help you, Caspian corrected gently. They love you, Thessaly. They're just scared because they don't understand what you're going through. Do you understand? He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I understand that losing something you've never had can be just as devastating as losing something you've held in your hands. I understand that sometimes the only way to cope with unbearable loss is to pretend it never happened, or to pretend it's still happening. She looked up at him, seeing the pain in his eyes that matched her own. You lost the baby too. Yes, but I also lost you twice. Once when you ended our relationship the first time, and again when the accident erased our second chance. I've been grieving for 3 years, Thessaly. Grieving for our child, for the life we might have built, for the woman I loved who couldn't remember loving me back. The sun was higher now, sending shafts of golden light through the snow-covered windows. The cabin felt ordinary in the daylight, stripped of the mysterious atmosphere that had made her delusions seem plausible. She was just a woman in borrowed clothes, sitting in a rented cabin with a man who had loved her through disasters both real and imagined. What happens now? She asked, echoing her earlier question. That depends on you, he said. We can't go back and change what happened. We can't bring back our baby or undo the accident or erase the years of pain. But we can decide what to do with what's left. She studied his face, seeing not the phantom lover of her memories but the real man, older, sadder, marked by loss but still capable of hope. Still willing to love her despite everything she'd put him through. I don't know how to stop grieving for something that feels more real than reality, she admitted. Maybe you don't have to stop, he said. Maybe you just learn to carry the grief alongside everything else, the love, the hope, the possibility of building something new from the pieces of what was broken. Outside, she could hear the sound of snow sliding off the roof, the world beginning to shed the weight of the storm. Soon the roads would be clear, and they could return to the life that waited for them beyond the cabin's walls. But first, she knew, she needed to say goodbye to the child that had never been born, to the life that had existed only in the space between desire and memory. "I want to remember them," she said quietly. "Our baby. I want to remember what it felt like to carry that life, even if it was only for a few weeks." "Then we'll remember together," Caspian said, reaching for her hand. "We'll remember, and we'll grieve, and we'll figure out how to honor what we lost by building something worth having with what remains." She squeezed his hand, feeling the solid warmth of human connection after so many years of careful isolation. It wasn't the fantasy life she constructed in her fractured mind, but it was real, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it was everything. 3 months later, Thessaly stood in the garden behind her Victorian house, watching the first green shoots of spring push through the dark earth. The snow had melted weeks ago, leaving behind the rich, loamy smell of awakening and the promise of things yet to bloom. She'd planted bulbs the previous fall, before the storm, before the cabin, before she'd learned to distinguish between memory and longing, and now they were emerging into the light. The house felt different now, less like a fortress against the world and more like a home that was slowly opening its doors to possibility. Caspian's books had begun to appear on her shelves, his coffee mug in her sink, his presence in the rooms that had been empty for so long. They were taking it slowly, learning to trust in the durability of real love rather than the intensity of imagined passion. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had become something she could carry rather than something that carried her away. She'd told her family the truth about the accident, about the pregnancy they'd never known existed, about the way trauma had fractured her sense of what was real. They'd listened with the patience of people who loved her enough to follow her through confusion and back to clarity. Cordelia had cried when she learned about the lost grandchild she'd never known about the nephew or niece who would exist only in the space between what was and what might have been. But she'd also held Thessaly while she grieved, understanding finally that her sister's solitude hadn't been a choice so much as a necessary defense against unbearable loss. The manuscript, the psychological thriller about the woman living someone else's life, sat finished on Thessaly's desk, ready to be sent to the publisher. She completed the final edit with new understanding of how the mind could construct elaborate fictions to protect itself from truths too painful to bear. The protagonist's journey from confusion to clarity had become her own roadmap back to reality. But reality, she'd learned, was more complex than she'd previously understood. The child she'd carried for those few precious weeks had been real, even if her body no longer remembered the weight. The love she'd shared with Caspian was real, even if her mind had forgotten it for a while. The life they were building together was real, even if it looked nothing like the fantasy she constructed in the storm-bound cabin. "Thessaly." Caspian's voice called from the kitchen window. "Your mother's on the phone." She made her way inside, brushing soil from her hands and smiling at the domestic normalcy of the moment. This was the life she was choosing now, not the dramatic passion of fiction, but the quiet satisfaction of shared daily existence. Love measured not in grand gestures, but in coffee made without being asked, in books left open to favorite passages, in the simple miracle of not being alone. "Hello, Mother," she said, taking the phone from Caspian. "Darling," Ophelia's voice was warm with the particular contentment of a mother who no longer had to worry about her child's happiness. "I was calling to ask about Sunday dinner. Will you and Caspian be joining us?" "Yes," Thessaly said, and felt the word reshape the future in small but significant ways. "We'll be there." After she hung up, she stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Caspian work at his laptop at the table by the window. He was writing again, not about women trapped between realities, but about the possibility of healing, of building something new from the ruins of what was lost. His presence in her house no longer felt like an invasion, but like a completion, the missing piece that made the picture whole. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what our child would have looked like?" He looked up from his writing, his eyes soft with the kind of sadness that had learned to coexist with joy. "Every day," he said simply. "I think about names sometimes," she continued. "Whether it would have been a boy or a girl, what kind of person they would have become." "Curious," he said. "Kind. Probably stubborn, with parents like us." She laughed, and the sound surprised her with its lightness. "Definitely reader. Can you imagine the bedtime stories we would have told?" "The best stories," he agreed. "The ones where love wins, even when it seems impossible." That evening, they walked through the neighborhood together, past houses glowing with warm light and the sound of families gathering around dinner tables. Thessaly no longer felt like an outsider looking in at other people's happiness. She was writing her own story now, one that acknowledged loss without being defined by it, that honored the past while remaining open to the future. At the corner where Maple Street met Oak, they paused under a streetlight just beginning to flicker on in the gathering dusk. In the distance, they could see the lights of Cordelia's house, where Sunday dinners would soon include two place settings instead of one, where the family story was being revised to accommodate new chapters of healing and hope. "Do you think she knows?" Thessaly asked quietly. "Our baby, do you think she knows we remember her?" Caspian was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think love doesn't end just because life does," he said finally. "I think the love we would have given her still exists somewhere, even if we can't give it to her directly. Maybe we can give it to other children," Thessaly said. "Volunteer at the library, read stories to kids who need them. Maybe love like that finds a way to reach the people who need it most." "Maybe it does," he agreed. They walked home through the spring evening, their footsteps echoing on sidewalks still damp from the morning's rain. Behind them, the lights of the neighborhood created a constellation of human connection, each house a story of people choosing to build something together despite the certainty of loss, the inevitability of pain, the fragile nature of all the things we love most. In her pocket, Thessaly carried the small ultrasound photograph she'd found among her things from the hospital, the only physical evidence of the life that had existed for such a brief time. It was blurry and indistinct, but she could make out the curve of a tiny spine, the suggestion of limbs still forming. Her daughter, she decided it was a daughter frozen in that moment between possibility and reality, between what was and what would never be. But she also carried Caspian's hand in hers, warm and solid and present. She carried the promise of Sunday dinners with her family, of stories yet to be written, of a garden that would bloom year after year with careful tending. She carried the knowledge that love, once created, never truly dies, it only transforms, finding new channels through which to flow. The Victorian house welcomed them home with windows glowing gold against the purple sky. Inside, their books sat side by side on the shelves, their coffee cups waited in the sink, their shared life spread out in small domestic details that had once seemed impossible and now felt inevitable. Thessaly had learned to live between memory and hope, between the life she'd lost and the life she was building. She learned that reality was not fixed but fluid, shaped by the stories we choose to tell and retell until they become true in all the ways that matter. And in the quiet hours before sleep, when Caspian's breathing had settled into the rhythm of dreams and the house had wrapped itself in nighttime silence, she would sometimes feel it again, the flutter of life. The presence of love that transcends the boundaries of what is possible and what is real. Not a delusion this time, but a promise that love finds a way, that stories have power, that even the briefest lives leave echoes that resonate long after the sound has faded into silence. In the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was everything.